Hi, I'm here to talk to you about the economic debt crisis of Latin America. And I'm sure as soon as you heard that title, you were thinking, I don't want to learn about this and I shouldn't have to learn about this. But the thing is, you should want to learn about it and you do have to learn about it. You have to learn about it because once I inform you about this problem, you can go inform all your friends about this problem. And once everybody is educated on this thing that affects so many human beings, then we can prevent it from happening in the future. And maybe if the U.S. had researched more on the economic debt crisis of Latin America, then we wouldn't be in this recession that we are in now. So pay attention. This crisis began in the beginning of the 1980s, and I guess you could say a summary sentence of the economic debt crisis of Latin America is that Latin American and Caribbean countries were experiencing low standards of living and saw foreign investment and trade decrease. This crisis was mainly caused by one reason, which was the drop in prices of Latin America's main exports, and the prices had gotten so low that they were lower than they had been in decades. And the main exports of Latin America were sugar, tin, copper, beef, and grain, and those are a lot of exports to be losing so much money in, which goes to show why this crisis was as bad as it was. And obviously, there are going to be bad effects in an economic debt crisis, but surprisingly, there were some good effects too. So I'll start with those first because positive is always better. Demographic, national managers, and educational changes had been changing the population of Latin American countries for a while, and they had actually made a better educated and more sophisticated working force. And because that had happened, more women could start working. And after that, workers were having less children, which actually helped the company out because then the workers could work more instead of having to take care of their children. And say there's a family with 2 children, 1 mom, and 1 dad, so it's 4 people. But then say there's a family with 5 children, a mom and a dad, and the moms are the only ones that work. In this family, the mom can support for the 2 children herself and her husband, but in this family, what if she can only provide for herself, her husband, and her 2 children? Then the 5 children are going to be malnourished, and it's just better to have less children than more children if the other children are going to be starving. So technically, having less children was really helping out the businesses and the families. And also, there was a decrease in the price of oil, and surprisingly, that would save about 7 debtor countries $2 billion. And even though that seems like a lot to us, it wasn't a lot to pay off the debt. But even though it wasn't a lot, it still gave them maybe a little push that they needed, so that was great. All the help you can get is great at all times. But of course, with an economic debt crisis, there are obviously going to be negative effects. And in my opinion, in all economic debt crises, the negative effects are mainly the same. I mean, people can't afford their homes, people can't afford money for food, businesses are closing down, and people can't even afford their children. I mean, they're like sending their children to work with relatives, to live with relatives. So those are some serious problems that really needed to be addressed. And once countries saw that they couldn't live the way they were living at that time and they needed to pay off their debt, they started trying. And the country that I think I worked the hardest to pay off this debt was Peru, because by 1986 they had paid its creditors about 14% of its trade income. And even though that might seem like a lot, it actually wasn't, because it was less than half of what was due. But even though so little, it was still a great progress that was made. And so I give them credit for that, for trying to get rid of this debt. And by March 23, 1986, Latin America's foreign debt had reached $186 billion. I mean, that debt was so high that this country was probably thinking they weren't going to get out of this crisis for maybe another 30 years. That's what I would think if I was a citizen. But lucky for them, the United States came in to help them. And Brady bonds were created, and those were repackaged securities that were created by Nicholas Bradley, who was an ex-U.S. Treasury Secretary. And that is the main thing that saved Latin America. It pushed them straight out of this debt crisis. So they should be thanking the United States. as you can see, you really do need to learn about this crisis so you can prevent other economic debt crises from happening. We saw what mistakes Latin America made, and not a lot. I mean, it just happened, but we can prevent it from happening to the United States because we know what Latin America did, and we can make sure not to make those mistakes ever again. And it's also pretty interesting to learn about. I mean, how a country can go into $186 billion worth of debt just because people weren't buying their exports. I mean, that's amazing to me. So, I hope you liked it. Thank you.